At 4:57 on a rainy Thursday afternoon, a bank teller held my grandfather's faded check beneath a blue inspection lamp and stopped breathing for a second. The check was for $18.16. It had been issued 27 years earlier. The paper had yellowed around the edges, and my grandfather had written the word proof across the back in his careful block handwriting. I had brought it to the bank expecting someone to confirm what I already believed, that it was an expired scrap of paper with no financial value. Instead, the teller quietly summoned the branch manager. The manager examined my driver's license, asked me to verify my mother's maiden name, and then walked to the entrance. He turned the sign from open to closed, locked the glass doors, and lowered the blinds. When he returned, he did not sit behind his desk. He sat beside me. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, keeping his voice low, "this check is connected to a trust account containing $4,682,000. I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. Then he added the sentence that changed the shape of my entire life. "According to the documents attached to that account, you died 11 years ago. I was alive. My grandfather had been dead for 6 weeks. And somehow, before I had even told my husband which bank I was visiting, he had already sent me 3 messages asking whether I had deposited Grandpa's check." Good day, dear listeners. It's Nora again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. At the time this happened, I was 45 years old and living in Columbus, Ohio. I worked as a payroll compliance coordinator for a regional hospital network. It was not glamorous work, but it suited me. I trusted records more than impressions. In payroll, a missing decimal point can take rent money from a nursing assistant. An incorrect employee number can send a surgeon's salary to the wrong account. Most mistakes are innocent, but the damage does not care whether the person who caused it meant well. That profession taught me to slow down whenever someone said, "It's probably nothing." Probably nothing is where expensive problems like to hide. My husband, Mark, used to tease me about that. He was a commercial insurance broker and could walk into a room of strangers as though they had all been waiting for him. He had a polished, reassuring manner that made people feel slightly foolish for worrying. For most of our 19-year marriage, I thought we balanced each other. I checked every figure twice. Mark signed where the colored tabs told him to sign. I planned, he persuaded. I noticed cracks. He painted over them and called the wall beautiful. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in Worthington. The mortgage was nearly paid, our cars were sensible, and our daughter, Sophie, had recently begun graduate school in Cincinnati. I believed we were entering the quieter part of marriage, the years when struggle was supposed to soften into companionship. Instead, Mark had become distant. He came home later, guarded his phone, and began talking about money in a tone that sounded casual, but never was. He said a few business investments had performed poorly. He assured me everything was manageable. Whenever I asked for numbers, he gave me feelings. "Don't worry, it's temporary. I've got it under control." Those phrases may comfort someone who does not work with accounts. To me, they sounded like blank fields in a financial report. My grandfather, Walter Hale, had never trusted Mark completely. Grandpa was not rude to him. He was rarely rude to anyone. He had spent 40 years repairing industrial machinery, and he approached people the way he approached old motors. He listened for irregular sounds and never assumed a clean exterior meant the internal parts were sound. After my mother died when I was 12, Grandpa became the steady center of my life. He packed my school lunches, taught me how to balance a checkbook, and sat through every painfully long student concert without checking his watch. He lived in the same narrow brick house in Dayton for 53 years. The curtains faded, the neighborhood changed, and property developers offered him increasingly absurd amounts of money, but he stayed. "Peace is worth more when you know where everything is," he used to say. He died quietly at 89, sitting in his kitchen with a cup of coffee beside him, and the morning newspaper folded to the business page. My Uncle Dean, my mother's younger brother, handled the estate. Dean had always appeared successful. He owned several small real estate companies, wore expensive coats, and spoke of money in vague, impressive quantities. At Grandpa's funeral, he told everyone the estate was simple. The house had been reverse mortgaged. Medical expenses had consumed the savings. After the creditors were paid, there would be almost nothing left. I did not question him. I had never expected an inheritance. Grandpa had already given me the things that mattered: stability when I had none, patience when I was difficult, and the certainty that at least one person in the world would always tell me the truth. A week after the funeral, Dean called and asked me to collect a metal toolbox Grandpa had labeled with my name. "That's all he specifically left you," Dean said. "Old paperwork and sentimental junk, probably." I was going to toss it, but Mark insisted you might want it. That sentence seemed harmless at the time. Later, I would remember it precisely. The toolbox was dark green, dented at both corners, and heavier than it appeared. Inside were ordinary reminders of Grandpa's life: socket wrenches, machine gauges, pencils sharpened with a pocket knife, and a small envelope sealed with yellowing tape. The envelope contained the $18 check. It was issued by Providence Community Bank on October 3, 1999, and made payable to Walter Hale, trustee for Nora E. Hale Bennett. The memo line contained a string of numbers followed by the words "Annual Maintenance Distribution." Across the back, Grandpa had written, "Nora, do not cash. Keep the original. If they tell you it means nothing, ask who closed the account." Proof. There was also a business card for an attorney named Charles Vale. Mark was standing behind me when I read it. He took the card from my hand before I could look closely. "Charles Vale," he said. "I know that name. He handled some estate work for your family, didn't he?" "I don't know." Mark turned the card over. "This check is ancient. Dean probably overlooked it. He said there was no trust. There probably isn't. Your grandfather kept everything." Mark laughed lightly, but his eyes remained on the check. I placed it back in the envelope. That evening, Mark asked whether I planned to call the bank. The next morning, he asked again. 2 days later, he offered to take the check there himself. His interest made me uncomfortable, although I could not have explained why. Mark had barely participated in Grandpa's care during his final years. He complained about the drive to Dayton, and often found reasons to miss family dinners. Yet suddenly, $18 mattered to him. I searched Providence Community Bank online and learned it had passed through 2 mergers. Its accounts were now held by Meridian Citizens Bank, which had a downtown branch near my office. Before visiting, I called Uncle Dean. When I mentioned the check, he went silent long enough for me to hear the faint clicking of his car's turn signal. Then he chuckled. "Dad kept that thing? What was the trust?" "There wasn't one, not really. Your grandfather tried setting something up after your mother died, but there was never enough money to fund it. Vale closed it years ago." "Why would Grandpa tell me to ask who closed the account? He was almost 90, Nora. You know how confused he became." Grandpa had occasionally forgotten where he put his reading glasses. He had never confused a bank account with $4 million. Still, I thanked Dean and ended the call without arguing. In payroll investigations, the first explanation you receive often becomes an anchor. Once it is in your mind, every later fact gets pulled toward it. I wrote Dean's exact words in a notebook so I could treat them as a statement, not as truth. There wasn't one. There was never enough money. Vale closed it. Grandpa was confused. Mark became strangely affectionate that night. He brought home Thai food, opened a bottle of wine, and suggested we spend the weekend at a hotel in Indianapolis. It was the kind of gesture I had wanted from him for months, but the timing felt like a payment arriving in an account before the supporting paperwork. When I said I needed to visit the bank first, his smile tightened. "You're making too much of this, probably. So throw the check away." "Why? Because it's $18, Nora. Then it doesn't matter if I ask." He studied me for a moment. Then his expression softened again. "Of course. I just don't want you getting hurt, because your grandfather left some confusing note." The following Thursday, I took an extended lunch break and went to Meridian Citizens Bank. The teller's name was Alyssa. She looked young enough to be my daughter. I explained that I was not trying to deposit the check, only wanted to know whether the account number could be traced through the bank's archived records. At first, everything happened exactly as I expected. Alyssa smiled politely, entered the numbers, and told me the check was far beyond the legal presentment period. I said I understood. She tried the old routing number, frowned, and entered it again. Then the color left her face. She asked for my identification. After comparing my license with the screen, she picked up the phone and spoke so quietly I could not hear her. A few minutes later, the branch manager, Thomas Reed, appeared. He asked where I had obtained the check and whether anyone else knew I had it. His questions were so careful that my skin began to prickle. At 5 Ingloft, the electronic lock clicked behind me. Thomas explained that closing the door was partly routine because the branch was ending business for the day, but he had also been instructed by the bank's legal department to keep the original check and its holder inside until they completed an identity verification process. I slid the envelope closer to my purse. "You're not keeping the original." "You're right," he said immediately. "I should have phrased that differently. We would like to examine it while you remain present." His willingness to correct himself made me trust him more than reassurance would have. Alyssa brought water. Thomas placed a speakerphone on the table, and a woman from the bank's fraud department joined us. That was when I learned about the trust. It had been established in 1994 by Grandpa and my mother, Ellen Hale, using revenue from a 12-acre industrial property our family had owned outside Dayton. My mother died before the documents were finalized, leaving Grandpa as trustee and me as sole beneficiary. The land itself was not especially valuable at first, but in 2007, a logistics company signed a long-term ground lease and constructed 2 distribution warehouses there. Lease income flowed into the trust. Under its terms, I was supposed to begin receiving quarterly distributions at 35. I was 45 and had never received $1. The $18 check had been issued during a year when the trust's only income was interest on a small escrow deposit. Grandpa apparently kept it instead of depositing it because it contained the original trust control number. In 2015, Charles Vale, acting as successor trustee, submitted documents claiming I had died without descendants. According to those documents, the trust assets were to be divided between a family charitable foundation and a company controlled by Uncle Dean. I felt as though I were listening to a report about another woman. "I have a daughter," I said. Thomas looked at me with genuine discomfort. "Yes, that creates an additional discrepancy." The trust had not been emptied. A bank compliance review had frozen its remaining assets 8 months earlier after someone attempted to transfer nearly $3 million to an account in the Cayman Islands. Until I walked in with the original check, the bank had been unable to verify whether the beneficiary information had been falsified or merely recorded incorrectly during one of the mergers. What evidence did they submit that I was dead? The fraud specialist could not disclose the documents without legal authorization, but she told me they included an affidavit, a beneficiary certification, and what appeared to be a death record. Who signed the certification? There was a pause. Charles Vale. My phone vibrated on the table. "Mark, did the bank accept it?" A second message appeared. "Mark, Nora, call me before you sign anything." I had not told him which day I was going. I turned the phone face down. Thomas made copies of the front and back of the check while I watched. I signed a receipt stating that the original remained in my possession. The bank's fraud specialist advised me to consult independent counsel before contacting any relatives or the attorney connected with the trust. Before I left, Thomas said something I would remember throughout the months that followed. "Mrs. Bennett, people hear a number like $4 million and think the number is the important part. Right now, the important part is that someone produced documents saying you were dead. Please behave accordingly." Outside, the rain had stopped, but I remained in my car for almost 40 minutes. I did not cry. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as a list. Someone knew about the trust. Someone had access to my identifying information. Someone had benefited from my supposed death. Mark knew I had gone to the bank, and Grandpa, who had been dismissed as confused, had hidden the one document capable of reopening the account trail. I called my supervisor and said I was ill. That was not entirely untrue. Then I drove to a 24-hour copy shop. I scanned the check, the envelope, Grandpa's note, and Charles Vale's business card. I uploaded encrypted copies to a new cloud account and placed the original documents in a safe deposit box at a bank Mark did not use. Only after doing that did I return home. Mark was waiting in the kitchen. How did it go? He tried to sound casual, but he had positioned himself between me and the hallway. They confirmed it was stale. His shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly. So that's it? They're checking the archives. What does that mean? I don't know yet. He came closer and placed both hands on the counter. Did you leave the check with them? No. Where is it? The question was too quick. I looked at my husband, the man who had held our daughter as a newborn, who knew how I took my coffee, who had stood beside me at my mother's grave every anniversary, and felt the first internal shift of a foundation I had believed was permanent. It's safe, I said. His face changed for less than a second. Then he smiled. Good, that's good. That night, he waited until he thought I was asleep and left the bedroom. I heard the door to our home office open. 10 minutes later, he returned. The next morning, the green toolbox had been moved. Nothing obvious was missing, but the pencils were facing the opposite direction, and one of the socket trays had been lifted. I took the toolbox to work. Beneath the bottom drawer, I found a thin metal panel held in place by 2 screws. Grandpa had hidden a small spiral ledger underneath it. The ledger contained dates, account numbers, lease amounts, and names. My profession made the pages more alarming, not less. Grandpa had recorded expected income beside actual deposits. Beginning in 2014, the figures stopped matching. Besides several missing payments, he had written CV. Beside one transfer for $240,000, he had written Dean temporary loan, never approved. And across the final page, Mark asked about Nora's signature, told him no. Check remains proof account existed before Vail changed records. I read that sentence until the letters blurred. I did not confront Mark. Confrontation is satisfying in stories because it produces immediate emotion. In real investigations, it warns the person who has the most reason to destroy evidence. Instead, I called an attorney. Mara Chen specialized in trust litigation and financial elder abuse. A former colleague had used her during a probate dispute and described her as quiet, expensive, and impossible to intimidate. Mara's office contained no grand mahogany desk or walls of theatrical law books. She sat at a round table, read every page I brought, and asked precise questions. Did Grandpa ever mention the industrial property? Had I signed estate documents in 2015? Had Mark ever asked me to sign blank pages? Who held my power of attorney? Did Uncle Dean know my social security number? When I explained that Mark had searched the toolbox, she stopped writing. Are you safe at home? I don't think he would physically hurt me. That isn't what I asked. The distinction embarrassed me because it was so clear. I don't know. Mara advised me not to disclose what the bank had found. She arranged for a forensic image of the ledger, sent a preservation letter to Meridian Citizens Bank, and filed an emergency petition in probate court requesting access to the trust records. She also referred me to a digital security specialist. We discovered that Mark's tablet was connected to my personal email account through an old shared password system. He could see bank appointment confirmations, cloud notifications, and messages from my uncle. I changed every password from a device he had never touched. Then I packed a suitcase and told Mark I needed space after Grandpa's death. He did not object. That hurt more than anger would have. I stayed in a small furnished apartment near the hospital. It smelled faintly of someone else's laundry detergent, and the radiator clicked through the night. Yet for the first time in months, I slept without wondering who was watching the light from my phone. 3 days after Mara filed the petition, Charles Vail called me. His voice was warm and controlled. Nora, I was very sorry to hear about Walter. He was an extraordinary man. Thank you. I understand you found an old check among his belongings. I looked across Mara's conference table. She nodded and activated the recording system after confirming that Ohio law permitted a participant to record the call. I found several old things. Of course, Walter struggled with organization in his later years. I'd be happy to help you sort through anything confusing. How did you hear about the check? A small pause. Dean mentioned it. I haven't told Dean what the bank found. I didn't say he had. Vail's tone remained pleasant, but the temperature of the conversation changed. He explained that Grandpa had created an informal family arrangement. Not a valid trust. The check, he said, had been generated during a bookkeeping experiment and carried no legal significance. Then why are you concerned about it? I'm concerned about you. Banks sometimes mishandle legacy data. They can make ordinary families believe they are entitled to funds that were never theirs. It was a polished sentence. It positioned the bank as incompetent, my family as ordinary, and me as potentially greedy, all without directly accusing anyone. I have a lawyer, I said. I'm sorry to hear that. Litigation damages families in ways money rarely repairs. If there is no money, what would we litigate over? For the first time, Vale's answer did not arrive immediately. I hope you'll call me before taking any irreversible step. After the call, Mara leaned back. He knows the account is frozen, she said. And he is afraid you have more than the check. We did. Grandpa's ledger led us to county property records. The original 12 acres had been purchased in 1982 by Walter Hale, Ellen Hale, and a machinist named Samuel Ortega. Samuel sold his share before the trust was created. My mother transferred hers into the trust shortly before her death, and Grandpa later added his interest. The recorded deed had never disappeared. It was public, signed, notarized, and remarkably clear. The trust had received more than $6 million in lease revenue over 19 years. Some of that money remained invested. Some had paid legitimate property taxes and maintenance costs, but at least $1.7 million had been transferred to entities connected to Dean. One entity, DRC Property Consulting, had charged the trust $14,000 a month for site supervision, even though the logistics company maintained the entire property. Another company billed $380,000 for environmental remediation. County records showed no remediation permit, inspection, or contractor. The deeper we looked, the more the accounts resembled a payroll register filled with invented employees. Each line looked ordinary alone. Together, they formed a system. Mara hired a forensic accountant named Luis Ramirez. He constructed a transaction map and traced hundreds of thousands of dollars from the trust to Dean's businesses, then into Vale Fiduciary Services, and finally into personal accounts. But the most painful payment was not the largest. In June 2016, Vale Fiduciary Services transferred $85,000 to an investment company owned by Mark. The payment description read, Consulting and Beneficiary Resolution. I stared at the document. My marriage had apparently been assigned a price. Mark and I had been struggling financially that year because Sophie needed surgery that our insurance initially refused to cover. I remembered Mark telling me he had earned an unusually large commission. We paid the medical bills, replaced our roof, and took a family trip to Charleston. I had thanked him for rescuing us. The money had come from helping other people declare me dead. Mara did not offer empty comfort. She let me sit with the statement until I could speak. What did beneficiary resolution require? We need discovery to prove that, she said. But I have a theory. The petition triggered a formal response from Vale. He submitted a copy of a 2015 beneficiary family settlement agreement bearing my signature. The agreement claimed I had accepted $120,000 in exchange for releasing all interest in the trust. A second document stated that after my supposed death, the remaining assets passed to contingent beneficiaries. The timeline made no sense. If I had released my interest, my death should have been irrelevant. If my death activated the contingent provisions, the release was unnecessary. People who falsify documents often create too much support. Every extra explanation adds another place where the story can break. The signature looked like mine. That frightened me more than a clumsy forgery would have. It curved in the same places. The final T had my distinctive backward stroke. Even Mara admitted it could fool someone unfamiliar with my handwriting. Then I noticed the date, September 18, 2015. On that day, I had been attending a payroll compliance conference in Louisville. I had presented a workshop at 2 p.m. The settlement agreement claimed I signed it in Vale's Dayton office at 1:30. My employer had travel records, hotel invoices, security badge data, conference photographs, and a video recording of my presentation. In the photograph Vale's office submitted as part of Smith's notarial file, the woman's face was not visible. Only a hand holding a pen appeared beside the documents. The hand wore my wedding ring. When Mara showed me the enlarged image, I felt sick. My ring had been missing for 3 days in the summer of 2015. Mark told me he had found it beneath the passenger seat of my car. The notary was an employee of Dean's company. She claimed she had verified my driver's license, but had failed to record its expiration date or document number. Her notary journal showed 3 appointments that afternoon, all written in the same ink, and all involving companies connected to Dean. Mara amended our complaint to include fraud, conversion, breach of fiduciary duty, civil conspiracy, and unjust enrichment. The court issued a temporary restraining order preventing movement of the trust's remaining funds. 2 days later, Mark appeared at my apartment. He carried flowers and a paper bag from my favorite bakery. I did not allow him inside. We sat at a small table in the building's lobby while a security camera recorded us. I had already sent Mara a message telling her he was there. Mark placed the flowers between us. "You've turned this into something it isn't." "What is it?" "A misunderstanding that can still be fixed." "Did you receive $85,000 from Charles Vale?" He looked at the tiled floor. "It was a consulting payment." "What did you consult on?" "Family negotiations." "I was the family being negotiated." His jaw tightened. "Your grandfather was unstable. Dean and Vale believed the trust would collapse under tax liabilities and lawsuits. They were trying to protect everyone. By saying I was dead, that came later. I wasn't involved in that." "Were you involved in the settlement agreement?" Mark leaned forward. "Nora, listen to me. We needed money. Sophie needed surgery. You were terrified, and I found a way to keep us from losing the house. You told me the money was a commission. I knew you wouldn't understand. I understand records. That's your problem." His voice rose, then softened immediately when the security guard looked toward us. "You turn everything into columns and evidence. Real life isn't payroll." "No," I said. "In payroll, people are expected to account for the money they take." He pushed the paper bag toward me. "Vale is offering $750,000. After taxes and legal fees, you'll still have more money than you've ever had. Sign a confidentiality agreement, withdraw the complaint, and we can repair our marriage." The calculation was so cold that for a moment I admired its clarity. He had priced my silence, my marriage, and my forgiveness in one offer. "What happens to Dean?" "We remain a family. And Vale, he retires." "What happens to the documents saying I'm dead?" "They're corrected." Privately, I stood. Mark reached for my wrist, but stopped before touching me. "You could lose everything in court," he said. "Then the evidence will show I was wrong. This will destroy Sophie's relationship with me." "No. What you did will affect your relationship with Sophie. My refusal to hide it is not the cause." His face hardened. "You always needed to be right." "No, Mark, I needed to be alive." I left the flowers on the table. The next morning, Vale's attorneys sent the formal settlement offer. It included a confidentiality clause, a denial of wrongdoing, and a requirement that I surrender every original document from Grandpa's toolbox. The offer did not mention the old check specifically. It did not need to. We rejected it. Once formal discovery began, Vale's calm public story started separating from the records beneath it. Bank archives produced the original trust agreement, complete with my mother's signature and Grandpa's. They also produced 20 years of internal correspondence. In 2008, a bank officer had written to Vale asking why no beneficiary distributions were being made. Vale replied that the beneficiary had requested all earnings be reinvested. I had made no such request. In 2012, another employee asked for updated identification. Vale supplied a photocopy of my driver's license. The copy had come from a mortgage application Mark and I completed the previous year. In 2014, Vale told the bank I was incapacitated and residing abroad. At that time, I was working full-time in Columbus and volunteering at Sophie's school. In 2015, the false settlement appeared. In 2016, Mark received his payment. In 2025, after the bank demanded direct verification from the beneficiary, Vale submitted the document reporting my death. The attached death record was not an official certificate. It was a digitally altered copy of my mother's death certificate. My name had replaced hers, but the certificate number still belonged to Ellen Hale. The mistake was small. It was also fatal to Vale's case. The State Vital Records Office confirmed in writing that no death certificate had ever been issued for me. The certificate number, date, and registrar's signature belonged to my mother's record from more than 3 decades earlier. Then Luis discovered why the Cayman transfer had been attempted. Grandpa had written to the bank 8 months before his death. His letter stated that I was alive, that he suspected Vale and Dean of diverting trust income, and that he had retained the original distribution check. Because Grandpa was no longer the acting trustee, the bank did not grant him account access. But the letter caused its compliance department to freeze the international transfer and begin an internal investigation. Someone at the bank notified Vale that the transfer had been stopped. 3 days later, Dean petitioned to have Grandpa declared mentally incompetent. The hearing never happened because Grandpa died first. Vale's attorneys continued insisting there had been accounting confusion, but no intentional fraud. They portrayed Grandpa as an elderly man who misunderstood complex trust administration. They described Dean's companies as legitimate service providers. They called Mark's payment a lawful consulting fee. Mara did not argue with their adjectives. She requested invoices, calendars, emails, phone records, engagement letters, and proof of services. Records have no interest in protecting reputations. Dean's supervision company had no employees. The environmental contractor's registered address was a mailbox. Mark's consulting company had issued only one invoice in its entire existence, the $85,000 bill to Vale, and Charles Vale had billed the trust for more than 400 hours of legal work related to my beneficiary negotiations. Although his calendar showed no meetings with me, the confrontation that finally stripped away his politeness happened during his deposition. Vale arrived in a navy suit with 2 attorneys. He looked composed, almost bored. His silver hair was perfectly cut, and he addressed Mara with the patient courtesy of a senior courier professional explaining basic law to an inexperienced colleague. For the first hour, he claimed limited memory. He could not recall who informed him of my death. He could not remember meeting me in 2015. He did not know why Mark had been paid. He had relied on staff. He had relied on Dean. He had relied on bank data. Responsibility moved around the table without ever landing in front of him. Then Mara placed Grandpa's $18 check on the screen. Vale's expression barely changed, but he stopped tapping his pen. "Have you seen this document before?" she asked. "I've seen a copy." "When?" "Recently." Mara displayed an email from 2015. Attached to the email was a scanned image of the same check. The email had been sent by Mark to Vale. The message read, "Walter still has the original. He says it proves Nora never released the trust. Dean is trying to get the toolbox. If Walter contacts the bank, we need the beneficiary status finalized first." Vale adjusted his cuff. "I receive many emails. Did you respond to this one?" "I don't recall." Mara displayed his answer, then obtained the original. "Once the death certification is accepted, the historical distribution check should be treated as void. But I do not want loose documents creating questions during the transfer." For the first time, Vale asked for a break. His attorneys conferred in the hallway for 37 minutes. When they returned, his politeness had become sharper. Mara continued, "Mr. Vale, who prepared the death certification?" "My office." "Who directed your office to prepare it?" "I don't recall." "Who altered Ellen Hale's death record?" "I reject the premise of that question. Did Nora Bennett die in 2015? "Apparently not." The answer was so detached that my hands began to shake beneath the table. Mara looked at me once, then returned to Vale. "Did you ever speak directly with Mrs. Bennett before certifying her death?" "I relied on family representatives." "Which representatives?" "Dean Hale and Mark Bennett." Vale's attorney objected, but the question remained. "I may have spoken with him. Did he tell you his wife was alive?" "I don't recall." Mara presented an audio recording. It came from Grandpa's old answering machine, which Uncle Dean had overlooked when clearing the house. A technician recovered several deleted messages. In one, Grandpa confronted Mark about the missing trust payments. Mark's recorded voice said, "Nora is alive, obviously. Nobody is saying otherwise. Vale just needs a clean way to move the account while we resolve it." Vale's face lost color. Mara let the silence remain. The law is often portrayed as dramatic speeches and sudden confessions. In reality, the most powerful moments can be very quiet. A document is placed beside a statement. A date is compared with a calendar. A person who has controlled the story for years realizes that the record no longer belongs to him. Mark's deposition occurred the following week. He denied wearing my wedding ring or arranging the false signing. He claimed the $85,000 had been used entirely for Sophie's care. Our bank records showed otherwise. $22,000 paid medical expenses. The rest covered Mark's private investment losses, credit card debt, and a deposit on a condominium I had never seen. The condominium belonged to a woman who worked in his office. That discovery hurt, but not in the way I expected. By then, I had already accepted that my marriage had been built over hidden rooms. The affair was simply another door. The decisive evidence came from the notary. Faced with the loss of her commission and possible criminal charges, she admitted that I had never appeared before her. Mark brought my driver's license copy and wedding ring. A woman from Dean's office posed as me for the photograph. Vale's assistant prepared the journal entries afterward. She had been paid $5,000. Her testimony connected every part of the scheme. Dean diverted trust income through false service companies. Vale produced documents to conceal the diversions and prepare the final transfer. Mark provided my identification, monitored me, helped reproduce my signature, and tried to recover Grandpa's original check. When Grandpa raised questions, they attacked his competence. When the bank demanded proof, they declared me dead. Mara requested summary judgment on the validity of the trust and my beneficiary status. The judge ruled that the original trust agreement was enforceable, the settlement agreement was fraudulent, and the death certification was invalid. The court removed Vale as trustee and appointed an independent fiduciary. It imposed a constructive trust over assets purchased with diverted money and ordered Dean's companies to provide a complete accounting. During the final hearing, Charles Vale sat 3 tables away from me. He never apologized. His attorney described him as an aging professional who had exercised poor judgment while trying to manage a difficult family dispute. Mara responded with one sentence: "Poor judgment does not require a forged death record." The judge referred the evidence to the county prosecutor, the state attorney general, and the disciplinary authority overseeing lawyers. Federal investigators also became involved because of the attempted international transfer and interstate bank communications. Vale surrendered his law license while criminal charges were pending. Dean's real estate companies entered receivership. Several properties were sold to satisfy the civil judgment. The notary accepted a cooperation agreement. Mark was charged with conspiracy, identity fraud, and submitting false financial documents. His insurance firm terminated him. Our divorce was finalized 11 months after I entered the bank. He sent me one letter asking me to tell Sophie that he had done everything for our family. I did not destroy the letter or answer it. I gave it to Sophie and allowed her to decide what relationship, if any, she wanted with him. For years, Mark had made choices for me while calling them protection. I would not repeat that pattern with our daughter. The financial resolution took longer than the headlines suggested. The bank released the frozen trust funds to the independent fiduciary. Assets traced to Dean and Vale were gradually recovered. Taxes, legitimate trust expenses, legal fees, and forensic accounting costs had to be calculated. In the end, the trust recovered a little over $4 million. Not every missing dollar came back. Some money had been spent years earlier and could not be collected. I received enough to make my future secure. But the first thing I bought was not a luxury car or an enormous house. I bought a new lock. Then I bought a small brick bungalow on the edge of Columbus with a sunroom and a neglected backyard. The kitchen cabinets were old, one window stuck during humid weather, and the garden contained more weeds than flowers. It felt honest. I kept working at the hospital network. Though I reduced my schedule to 4 days a week, some colleagues could not understand why I continued working after receiving the trust. The answer was simple. My job reminded me who I had been before other people assigned a number to my silence. Competence had carried me through fear. I did not want to abandon it merely because I could afford to. I used part of the recovered money to establish a small fund in my mother's and grandfather's names. It helps older people obtain independent legal reviews before signing property transfers, powers of attorney, or trust amendments. The fund does not place our family name on buildings. Most recipients will never know who I am. That is exactly how I prefer it. Grandpa's Dayton house had to be sold as part of the estate, but before closing, I was allowed one final visit. The kitchen looked smaller without him. A pale circle remained on the wall where his clock had hung. In the garage, outlines of tools were still visible on the pegboard. I sat in his chair and placed the old $18 check on the table. For months, I had thought of it as evidence, an account number, a dated instrument, a preserved original that contradicted fraudulent records. Sitting there, I understood it was also an act of faith. Grandpa did not know exactly when I would find it. He did not know whether the bank's archives would survive mergers or whether I would believe his note. He only knew that truth sometimes needs a physical object to protect it until the right person is ready to ask the right question. He could not defeat Vale Dean and Mark by himself, so he left me a starting point. I framed a copy of the check and placed it above the desk in my new sunroom. The original remains secured with the trust records. My garden has changed slowly. The first year, almost everything I planted died because the soil drained poorly. I learned to test it, amend it, and wait. Healing was similar. I did not wake one morning free of betrayal. I stopped checking whether Mark had written. I began eating dinner without replaying old conversations. I traveled with Sophie to Charleston and created new memories in a city that had once been funded by a lie. Peace returned in small, measurable deposits, a full night's sleep, a Sunday without fear, a decision made without wondering who might punish me for it, a home where every key belonged to me. People sometimes ask whether I regret pursuing the case because it destroyed my family. I tell them the case did not destroy my family. It documented what had already been done. Evidence can feel cruel because it removes the comforting version of events. But a comforting lie is not peace. It is only a room whose door someone else controls. Grandpa's final check was financially worthless. No bank would ever pay $18.16 on an instrument that old. Yet it taught me that value and price are not the same thing. The check's price was nothing. Its value was the truth, and the truth gave me back something more important than an inheritance. It gave me legal existence when powerful people had erased me on paper. It gave me the courage to examine my marriage without accepting Mark's explanations. Most of all, it gave me the right to rebuild my life without apologizing for surviving what others had planned for me. If someone tells you a document means nothing, ask why they want it destroyed. If someone pressures you to decide before you have the records, slow down. And if a person calls control protection, look carefully at who benefits from your silence. Patience is not weakness. Documentation is not coldness. Calm people can still fight with extraordinary strength. Sometimes justice does not arrive with shouting or revenge. Sometimes it arrives as a woman, sitting quietly beside her lawyer while a carefully constructed lie collapses one dated page at a time. So tell me, dear listeners, if you discovered that the people closest to you had declared you dead to steal your inheritance, what would you have done?